Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. Good topic? Let's do it. What's the most disturbing thing you've ever seen? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. I was the first to come up on a car that had gone off the road in a blizzard. The elderly man driving just hit his head, but they'd come to a stop against the utility pole. The passenger side was pretty well mangled. His wife was on that side and had very much not survived. I did my best to be a good Boy Scout, to stay calm and reassure the man, but he was hysterical. This was before cell phones. I had to run across a small field to the next house to call 911. As I left, the man was furious with me, insisting I assist his wife. He couldn't acknowledge that she had been fatally crushed, and his wail followed me into the snow as I ran toward the house. It's been 28 years and I'm still emotional about it. I was getting off of work in downtown Phoenix and witnessed a homeless man jump off the top of our parking garage straight into the pavement. Something about the sound of his body hitting the concrete and seeing so much blood messed me up. I was the first person there when someone took a headfirst dive from a 6th floor onto cement. Every short, convulsive breath out, she was expelling bloody foam. Judging by the damage to her head and chest, I don't think there was any proper conscious thought happening before she finally died a few minutes later. A prisoner stood behind his door flap at night, slowly slashing open his face from side to side while I waited for support to come from my code red. Not enough staff on, so that was delayed into de-escalation mode, which took half an hour before he stopped, and I could advise him on how to dress his self-inflicted wounds before HC and backup were able to arrive. 2 female colleagues of mine had to witness a guy literally disemboweling himself in his cell at night while talking to them through the flap. Wounds full of maggots. Guy came to the office and told the desk he had a wound he was worried about. As I walked him back, I could smell the wound already. The sock was crusted to the leg with dried drainage of gray or blue. The sock was also moving, wriggling. She told me she hadn't looked at the wound in a few days. In anticipation, I placed the trash can under his leg, which was hanging over the edge of the exam table, a wound RN trick of the trade. I removed the sock with some difficulty to reveal a heavily infected foot or leg and about 300 maggots falling out of the wound, a baseball-sized hole tracking to bone into the trash. Like that scene in Nightmare Before Christmas where Oogie Boogie gets unwound. I proceeded to flush out the wound and dig the rest out as best I could. I then redressed the wound and called the ambulance to take him to the hospital. He was also seriously ill, bordering sepsis. He got to keep his leg. Did the maggots save his leg? Maybe. Maybe I was just lucky. A minibus taxi was T-boned by a bus. One side of the taxi was smashed in. A lot of the people on that side got half ejected out of the broken windows, and then the vehicle rolled over onto that side, squishing them. One lady got her head in a weird sandwich consisting of the road, her head, another guy's head, and the vehicle. I guess her head wasn't as strong as his and got crushed. Anyway, climbing into that vehicle to dig through the dead to get the living out wasn't nice. When everyone was put away, I found a phone lying in a pool of blood and it was ringing. When it stopped ringing, I saw that the background was a photo of a little kid. I really hope that phone was the property of someone who didn't die. The building next to my place of work caught fire and the fire department had not yet arrived. We heard screaming and I ran over to help. People on the top floors where the fire was were beginning to break out windows and beg for help from everyone down below. One woman was screaming that she had to jump because of the heat, and all we could do was beg her to wait as long as possible. She managed to stay up in that window and was rescued, but she was burned, bleeding, and hysterical. Everything she said was in Spanish, so it was even more terrifying in a way, as I do not speak Spanish, but could understand her emotion. Everybody lost their homes. Families were crying. People lost their pets. It was horrible. When I was 16 years old, I watched this giant dude drag a sobbing toddler out of a store, throw him in the back seat of a car, and start punching him, closed fist to the head and face of a literal 2 to 4 year old baby. I immediately called 911 and went into the store to find security. Obviously, I knew that abuse existed in the world, and I watched my cousins be disciplined in a manner that I knew was more than harsh than I'd been punished, but this was pure rage and just broke something inside of me. That was over 20 years ago, and it still haunts me. My daughter is in a coffin. Even though I know she was gone, my mind kept saying she was cold, and I needed to hold her. I sat like a rock, my hands in fists, because I was afraid I'd actually climb in there with her. I couldn't appreciate anything anyone said because all I could do was try not to move. My dad died in front of me of heart failure. I guess the disturbing part was trying to do CPR on him, his body being cold and pale to the touch, on call with the paramedics while my mother was screaming in the background and begging for him to come back. We had just spent a couple of beautiful days together. I miss him so much. I can still see the scene every time I try to sleep. Only a few days have passed. The second was my ill dog sliding between the stairs on the second floor and dropping down out of the blue. She was mostly blind, but that was messed up. I've read dogs do that sometimes, but the scene and her whines are something I'll never forget. I visited my girlfriend in an inpatient behavioral health facility, or psych ward. The place was awful. It was like the psych wards you see in horror films. A huge white room with flickering fluorescent lights, one or two dirty couches, and a small television attached to the ceiling. There were also doors leading to the patients' rooms. The patients all looked like zombies, barely coherent, all thin and sick-looking, just pacing. Most seemed so drugged up that they were unable to speak. Some were mumbling and rocking back and forth. I was led by a staff member to a room within the room for a visit. I sat down in the room to wait for my girlfriend. As she walked out, a tall young man who looked quite emancipated, was obviously jittery and manic, came quickly to the large window, looked straight into my eyes and said, "You have to get her out of here. They're hurting her," before staff shooed him away. When I finally saw my girlfriend, I was devastated instantly. I barely recognized her. It was only her second day there. She had bruises on her neck, back, wrists, and face. She was in and out of consciousness and barely able to speak. She was humiliated, terrified, begging to go home as much as she could, thinner than I'd ever seen her, unshowered and wearing little girl's pink pajamas, provided by the facility, that revealed so much of her body on a co-ed psychiatric floor. She was a 29-year-old Marine who was physically strong prior to all of this. So many inhumane and unethical things happened to that poor woman in there. Sometimes we get snapshots of a story and people don't give all the details for time constraints or whatever, and sometimes you get 8-minute long stories. This one in particular, I really would have liked to have known how she ended up in that facility, and did she make it out, and what happened. So, hope she's all right. I saw an old guy crossing a street, and he chose a very bad place to cross. He fell because his shoe got stuck in the track of the tram, so he fell straight forward, and his head landed directly in front of the back wheel of a garbage truck. The driver didn't notice him, and all that was left of his head was pulp, like in a bad splatter movie. That was 20 years ago in Vienna, and the memory is deeply etched into my brain. Former police officer in the southern U.S. I was a part of a tactical team that responded to a hostage situation where a male was holding a gun to a pregnant female's head and forcing her to run from the police. The pursuit was coming into our city, so we got ahead of it to help our department as much better funding and greater tactical capabilities, plus we just have better manpower since we're a larger city. The pursuit had been going on for about 3 hours at this point. Upon entering our city, the vehicle ended up wrecking while trying to navigate our congested freeways. Bad guy and female were in a wrecked car and moving around a lot as we began to set a perimeter around the vehicle, as well as shielding the freeway public that happened to be near the wreck. I was a designated marksman, which means I had to find a position to set up an overwatch. I happened to be working with a different partner that day, as my usual job was training another newer officer. This means that getting set up took a few seconds longer than normal, no big deal, as there are just short-term things you build with someone after working with them for 5+ years that I didn't have with this temporary partner. By the time I got set up on site, the Overwatch helicopter told us there was significant movement in the front seat. They hovered low enough to get a better sight picture and were able to determine the male was sitting in the driver's seat, had pulled the female on top of him, and was utilizing her as a human shield. Just as this information was put out over the radio, I trained my sights on the target area and confirmed the visual description provided by the air unit. The female began kicking the windshield in a desperate attempt to garner an escape route from the chapter. At the same moment, 2 muffled gunshots rang out. It was difficult to tell, but from my vantage point it was clear it had come from inside the vehicle, due to muzzle discharge and the windshield shattering in a more violent pattern than her kicks were providing. This triggered the REACT team to go from standby to rescue mode, and they tactically moved up to the vehicle in a 5-man stack. I watched as they broke the side windows to gain access, gave loud verbal commands, and then promptly shot the aggressor point blank in the face. His head proceeded to split open like an exploded watermelon. The female was pulled from the vehicle and provided medical attention. We worked her on the freeway for about 3 minutes, but the massive traffic backups from shutting down the freeway had prevented EMS from being able to easily access the scene. Officers loaded her into a squad car and navigated to the waiting hospital, where she and the child succumbed to their injuries. This incident gave me a very intense amount of PTSD, and is something I still work through to this day. About a month later, I responded to another hostage situation at a home, and due to being the first tactical unit to arrive on scene, I ended up being the point of contact with the subject of the incident. We built a rapport, and I was able to talk him out of the house and into the front yard safely, where he was able to be taken into custody by a waiting REACT team without any incident. I saw this as a sign of the universe providing me some sense of balance to the other traumatic incident, and promptly retired early from police work with my one-on-one hostage incident outcomes. I don't regret leaving for a second, but I miss helping people. Firefighter paramedic is here, so I've seen a ton. 2 or 3 are the top of my list. Number 1, a guy in a steel mill fell 90 feet from a crane directly onto his head. He looked like a Halloween mask. He was mushy, but one eye was popping out and looking right at me. Also, brains have a very unique smell. 2, an older lady crashed head-on into a truck. We basically had to scoop her out with a soup ladle because she was in pieces. She was also decapitated, and her head was in the back seat. I had to basically pick the head up by the hair and put it with the rest in the body bag. 3, lady got run over accidentally by her husband by his flatbed truck that had a steel coil on it. She was split from her left thigh up through her stomach, and the lower part of her diaphragm was out. Someone knocked on the door and handed me a grocery bag with her intestines. She was alive and lived for a couple of days, but on the way to the hospital, I was in charge of her airway. She was completely conscious, and she begged me not to let her die. As you could see, her color drained from her face. As I was writing this, I thought of a more recent one. I was pulled up in a car accident, and the car was on fire. I was in an ambulance, and the fire truck was still a few minutes away. I tried to pull someone out. You could hear him moaning, but the fire was too hot, and I had to wait to get water from the fire truck. Once the fire was out, I had to obviously see this dead, but was completely burned. His hands were burned off, completely unrecognizable. I ended up being a 20-year-old kid. Yeah, it's cool. I'm effed up. At 16 years old, I was working at a local movie theater and showed up early Sunday morning because I ran the projectors. Saw a car off by itself in the parking lot and just walked over to see what was up with it. A man had shot himself inside it. He's clearly been out there for a while, as there were a dozen or so cigarette butts on the ground outside the car, and the door itself was slightly ajar. As I leaned onto it to get a closer look, I saw that he'd used a .357 to blow his head half off. As I touched the door, it opened a bit, and this giant congealed glob of his blood and brains fell out along the line of the door seal. I almost got kicked out of the Corps when I told this story to a Navy doctor, when he casually asked me if I'd seen anything bad at my age. I joined the day I turned 17. Apparently, he'd tried to make a case that I wasn't fit for service. So far to date was seeing paramedics doing CPR trying to save my dad. My mom had called me one morning and in a desperate voice said, "Come quick, Dad's collapsed." All I could get out was okay, as I quickly got off the phone with her and started dialing my fiance's number. I told him Dad had a heart attack and to come home. No one told me it was a heart attack, I just knew. It felt like hours for the paramedics to arrive, but when they did, I was ushered out of the garage where he had collapsed. They ended up having to open the garage door to bring in equipment, etc. And while I was far enough from the scene that I couldn't see anything, I could hear my mom bawling and went to go comfort her till I saw the paramedics giving my dad CPR. It was so violent the way they were doing it, but I knew they had to do it in order to save his life. My dad, however, did not make it and passed away instantly from the heart attack. There's a lot of missing context, and for that I apologize. I just can't get too much into it as it still hurts to think about.